Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that you can head on off into your days and weeks fully armed with some perspective on the goings-on in the world around us. And to kick off this week, reminder that you can find all about us at tertiumquids.org, and archived footage of this program, our podcasts, are up online on YouTube under Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Our first guest is joining us from the University of Guelph. He is professor of economics and chair in sustainable commerce. And there's a word that sometimes people just don't like using that, but it's a perfectly good word. Ross McKintrick is joining us. A great piece on the extreme weather patterns. And if you ever feel like you're being politicked by people, the Green New Deal crowd is particularly zealous over the extreme weather, tornadoes, hurricanes. All you really have to do is have a microburst in your neighborhood, and somebody is going to be going on about extreme weather. And he's written a piece regarding a scientist that's proved climate change isn't causing extreme weather, and then, of course, was attacked for it. Professor McKintrick, thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Joe. The article you're referring to, I wrote it a few weeks ago in the National Post here in Canada. It concerns a meteorologist in Colorado named Roger Pielke Jr. His work primarily had to do with the connections between extreme weather and the value of losses to insurance companies from damage claims, and that's where he was focused. And what he and his colleagues were finding was that those damage claims are going up, but that's not an indication that extreme weather is going up. They're going up pretty much in step with the size of the economy and the number of buildings and valuable stuff that's insured. So once you back out the economic factors, inflation and the size of the economy, there wasn't an upward trend in climate-related damages. From there, they also did work just looking at trends in these big indicators, such as the number of hurricanes making landfall in the United States, the number of tornadoes, heat waves, extreme precipitation events, all the usual indicators that people think of regarding extreme weather. And out of that list, the way they've summarized it, Roger, as well as others who work in the field, is that there's indications that there are more heat waves in parts of the world than there used to be. But the other indicators just aren't showing trends. That the rate of landfall, for instance, of hurricanes is within historical norms, tornadoes, you name it. These are very variable systems in nature. We've always had them. These kinds of extreme events do happen. And the big trends just aren't there. Flooding is another one that has been discussed quite a bit in Canada recently. But there again, the conclusion, and this was reflected in all the expert reports, that when you look at the historical data, there's no compelling evidence of an increase in the number or the severity of floods happening across Canada and the United States as well. Droughts, another one again. So when Roger was invited to testify before Congress in 2015, he went in armed with all the data, and he made a presentation of it, and the administration, the Obama administration, attacked him quite ferociously. The science advisor wrote a long memo attacking him and claiming his information was wrong, and a Democrat representative, Grijalva, launched an inquiry into Roger and a few of his colleagues, claiming they must be secretly funded by the fossil fuel sector, and then other organizations like Media Matters launched a campaign to try to get him removed from news organizations that he was contracted to write for, and it ended up being such an ordeal that he quit the field. He decided to change his major focus at the university. He now studies sports management, and he comments a little bit on climate issues, but he got out of the field of meteorology. And but a year later, he went to the University of Minnesota on invitation, and he told this story. And so I found that his story very interesting, especially with all the discussion of extreme weather and climate. And so I wrote an article to tell the story. And that really got a lot of attention. I think it registered with people that this indicates something's wrong in the field if he can be drummed out essentially for saying what all the experts had agreed on.
Well, in certainly a scientific pursuit, if you have data, one would like to believe that if you've collected all the research and you've laid it out there, that science is science. We're told that supposedly science is settled, but what really is disquieting is beyond his research and what he found about extreme weather, quote unquote, is extreme activism and how somebody can have their livelihood taken away from them just by the behavior, certainly, with the backing of government, even if it's hand in glove. That to me is the most dangerous part of this, is that we've wound a society so much intertwined with government that if you fly in the face of government dogma, you could find yourself unemployed, and in his case, luckily, he could teach something else. But what if he couldn't? What if he couldn't teach anything else, and he wound up slinging hamburgers somewhere?
Well, that has to be on the mind of people working in the field. It was quite extraordinary to watch the process as it unfolded at the time, that somebody would be invited to go to Washington and testify. It's kind of any scientist hopes for an opportunity to present their research to policymakers, and then to be on the receiving end of not just questions. I mean, you always get questioned when you present your evidence at hearings. I've done it myself.
Sure. Yeah.
People even will really ask probing and potentially hostile questions. But if you have all the data in front of you, then it's just something that you can answer. But to have his personal motives attacked and be attacked on political grounds, and it sort of speaks to this problem that you alluded to, that we like to think of science as just being about the facts, the data, and that's what should inform public policy. But when the information really goes against a partisan agenda, then science is out the window. And there are a lot of people that think that the Democrats in the U.S. are the ones that want to have science in its proper place in the policymaking process. But this was an episode where they were the bad guys, and they got a message they didn't like, and instead of just digesting it and assimilating the information, they turned around and attacked on political grounds.
Well, and certainly the analogy to the way, the church doctrine treated some of the Enlightenment thinkers and the scientists of the Dark Ages, even as they started to question, you think of Galileo's and what they faced. We'd like to think we're more evolved than that. Ross McKintrick is a professor of economics at the University of Guelph. He's also with the Fraser Institute, joining us talking about this issue with a professor who was just driven from the pursuit of science by political and agendized science himself. We've seen here in Virginia, and we've covered the story of this movement through NYU and a nonprofit funded by Michael Bloomberg's organization to pay for attorneys general or associate attorneys general to work out of some of the attorney general's offices in New York, Oregon, Maryland, and even started here in Virginia. And what you're talking about is done without the force of law. And if we're able to see these sorts of attorneys general offices be co-opted into this sort of lynch mob, I really fear that people could wind up going to jail if we allow this to continue out this Pandora's box. I'm just sort of role playing it out a little bit further. If we allow these attorney generals to have special assistance paid for by those who have a particular climate or science agenda, we could really be falling into a bad period of time.
Yeah, that issue that you're alluding to, I know a little bit about it. I've read some of the news items that have come out, and it just sounds remarkable in a horrifying sort of way that private green groups essentially are placing staff inside attorney general's offices to do litigation support towards prosecuting their opponents, and I can't see how that could possibly be allowed. I mean, it's not hard to imagine the shoe on the other foot of that. The media would be all over it if I don't know if large corporations were able to just dispatch lawyers over to the Attorney General's office and pin a badge on them, and now they get to be state prosecutors. It's unimaginable to me that it destroys the notion of the Attorney General and the state prosecutor as being an independent public entity.
Well, and we saw what happened to this professor just without that. And I can imagine if that all of a sudden you have the force of the state's top, prosecutor coming down on you, it becomes even easier to persecute in the realm of prosecution. But beyond that, also it's agendized science, where we've also covered in several instances where government is paying for science to come up with the conclusions that they want that fit, a particular ideological outcome. That's also a dangerous field, and certainly something that I'm sure you've seen as you study this, is that if government wants an answer, and maybe this goes back to how much sway government should have over an economy, that if they want an answer, they can pay for or fund science that makes their answers for them.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed much more now than earlier in my career, that here in Canada, the major federal funding agencies, they're less and less committed to just open-ended research questions where they make a certain amount of money available for good research ideas, and you have to convince a committee of your peers to fund whatever project you come up with. Nowadays, the funds are much more for preset topics on preset themes, where it's very clear in the wording of the proposal what it is that they want. They want to find, for instance, nowadays it's very common to see grant competitions that are predicated on the idea that climate change is going to be a catastrophe, and they're just looking for information on how to help communities adapt to catastrophic climate change. Now, if your research says that community is actually not likely to experience any harmful effects for the next 50 to 100 years based on what we know, you're not going to qualify for that grant money. So instead, you just won't bother going through the process, and somebody else will apply for it who's willing to just put in the boilerplate language that satisfies the premises, and then they'll come up with something. But it then helps reinforce this whole process that all the science is delivering this common message, because we are at a point where a lot of these funding competitions announce in advance what message they want to get.
Professor McKintrick, you mentioned in the story of the professor who lost his position for having the heresy to question in his research, discovering that these extreme weather events, though they may have caused high damage figures for insurance companies, in the actuarial sense they were extreme, but they weren't any more extreme than they had been in the past. We've just started building in floodplains or on beaches and in places where there's a greater opportunity for substantial property damage from these events. Here in Virginia Beach tends to be a place where a lot of this rhetoric comes down, and the naval yards, many folks who push the idea of climate change, man-made climate change, say, well, it's a national defense issue because, the naval station Atlantis is right here and it's sinking, or the sea is rising up over it. And it was pointed out that actually science has shown that it's erosion, that the land is actually sinking, not that the water's rising. And I had a climatologists say, well, what's the difference? The water is higher than it was. But it's an enormous difference if you're trying to fix something. If you're having an erosion problem and the land's leaving, you can fix that in a different way than you would fix, say, the tide rising. But they seem to think that, the end result is the same. So what's the difference? But in the scientific world, I think it's an enormous difference, don't you?
Yeah, and either way, we are talking about changes on the scale at most of 1 millimeter or 2 per year. Mm-hmm. And I would hope that the United States Navy is capable of building its shoreline infrastructure in such a way that it won't be wiped out by 2 or 3 millimeters of higher tide. As you say, regardless of the cause, if that defeats the planning capacity of the United States military, then you guys have a lot of problems to look at.
The whole world does. So at the end of the story, Professor, what is, and I feel like the answer is government should be involved in industries less and less. You talk about, and in your title, it's sustainable commerce. To me, sustainable commerce is whatever commerce the customer wants, but it seems like government is more and more getting involved in, whether it's GE or Enron back in the day, and trying to come up with ways to force us into energy plans that don't do anything, and nor does it fix any perceived climate issues. Government involved in commerce tends to be a bad formula, isn't it?
It does tend to have the problem of crony capitalism, that companies get good at seeking subsidies and selling policymakers on contraptions that they could never sell the public on. And so those companies, you mentioned GE, for instance, they made a strategic decision to get into building renewable energy systems, but then now that they're in that, they have an incentive also to lobby policymakers to require utilities to buy renewable energy. So it becomes a vicious circle that way. I don't think it's long-term a good idea for the private sector to be surviving that way, but certainly there are companies that can make out very well for a long period of time, but it is at the expense of the consumer, because typically what happens is you couldn't sell your product to the public on its own merits, so then you went and found a friendly politician to pass a law that forces the public to buy it.
Right, and then tries to say, well, we've all chipped in to buy it for you, and by all, he means the taxpayers. Professor, what should we be looking at, not just nationally, and from your view, Canadian, it's a little different, but certainly we're all vested here on the North American continent. As we look forward, and the president has talked about some of his ecological desires regarding natural gas and that kind of thing, but is the marketplace itself capable of doing what it did when gasoline replaced coal? And electricity replaced kerosene as lighting source because it was more economical, or are we doomed for at least the foreseeable future into a crony capitalist world where whatever we see in the marketplace is what the government wants us to?
Well, the U.S. is actually a good example of a general rule that as economies, at least Western advanced economies, as they grow, they tend to grow a little cleaner every year. So we get about 1% more energy efficient every year as a rule, and that's been a trend for a long, long time. And also, people just prefer to have their local environment cleaner rather than dirty. So as the money is available for communities to invest in pollution control, they do so. And in the case of your power grid, for instance, innovation suddenly made large sources of natural gas available at a much lower cost than before, and power plants began switching over from coal to natural gas, which is a cleaner fuel. Nobody had to force them to do it, although there were regulations that at the margin were forcing some to switch over, but a big part of the switch was just the cost savings. And cars, for instance, starting in the 1970s, when the Japanese began shipping small cars over to North America, and they simply stole vast sections of the market away from the big three U.S. Automakers. That was consumers looking at these smaller cars and saying, well, they're cheaper to drive and they're cleaner, and we'd rather have these than what the big three are offering. And so that kind of shift was driven by consumer preferences and by innovation and competition. Now, there's always going to be a role in environmental policy for regulation and for the government to set the overall targets and plans. But looking at the long-term history, the U.S., for instance, has cleaned up quite a bit. Air quality is much better now in the U.S. than it was at the end of the Second World War, for instance. And where the big improvements came from, it wasn't just government regulations. So a lot of it was just technological improvement and people wanting to be more efficient in the way they use energy, and also just wanting to have a cleaner local environment.
Well, I appreciate your time with us this week, Professor McKintrick from the University of Guelph and the Fraser Institute. Thank you for writing the story about the attack on academia over climate change and extreme weather, but also your insights as well into the economics of it all. And you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for calling.
And don't forget, you can find these anytime archived at our YouTube channel at freedomandprosperity.com. And thank you for listening from all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Till next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.